Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we'll be looking at Volume 9, Issue 5, At the Point of a Sarissa, Warriors of the Hellenistic Age. To discuss the topic, I'm joined by Josho Browuers, Dahm, and Marc de Santis. So let's start with the Hellenistic Age. When are we talking about?
The usual definition of the Hellenistic Age is the death of Alexander through to the Battle of Actium, which, 323 to 31 BC. And of course, weirdly, that's also a geographic limitation because that also encompasses the Second Punic War and the rise of the Roman Empire as well. Indeed, even the First Punic War. So it's a sort of a geographic region of the Eastern Mediterranean and the former Alexandrian Empire is what makes the Hellenistic period, even though it's actually also a geographic region.
With the death of Alexander, did the armies carry on resembling and fighting his style of war?
I think largely that they did. The main difference between Alexander's army and the armies of his Hellenistic successors was the greater reliance on the successors on infantry, the phalanx, less on cavalry. Alexander mainly used the phalanx as his, fix the enemy in place. He would operate off and deliver the phalanx and deliver the death blow to the enemy army with his cavalry, which he led in person. It seems that in successor armies, it was the phalanx that was the most powerful arm. Maybe because they had fewer cavalry. They did incorporate elephants too. That acted as a real striking arm too. But we hear again and again that the infantry, especially the silver shields, were very powerful, sort of like the spearhead of the army, Diodorus calls them.
Yeah, the Hellenistic armies after Alexander really, like his father, used the hammer and anvil method, where you have the phalanx pinning the enemy and then the cavalry smashing into the enemy and softening them up and causing them to rout eventually. And you see that after Alexander dies, that sort of ends, and instead they first try to sort of maintain the Alexandrian system, and then slowly they start relying more on the infantry, and they start adding other stuff, most notably, of course, in the third century, the war elephants, with which every self-respecting Hellenistic monarch had to use, but they were not always successful. Let's say that. And they also experimented with scythed chariots, which we talked about in the Seleucid issue, for example. So there were lots of experimentation going on, but Marc is correct in saying that it's largely infantry based, really the core of the armies.
I think one of the other issues, of course, is that because the successor states were trying to each claim the position that Alexander had occupied, and were, this dream of reuniting the empire of Alexander, there was a sort of a precedent that you had to have Alexander's army, and therefore lead it in Alexander's way and emulate Alexander, along with all of the other paraphernalia of Alexander's rule that they keep. So they keep the phalanx. They don't look to innovate any further because the phalanx works, and therefore what happens is essentially this sort of Hellenistic arms race of let's get bigger and more gargantuan phalanxes. So the phalanxes just start to expand and expand and expand and get massive. And of course, as you say, manpower is one of the major issues. And so you find them breaking the rules of a Macedonian phalanx and having locals in their phalanx. And, the Egyptians have an Egyptian phalanx, which is sort of, this sort of cultural taboo. But because of the manpower issue, they create ever larger phalanxes, and so then they add these other elements to it. So you get these enormous armies, and even if the numbers are wrong in our sources, they are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think one of the major issues for them is that because they're stuck trying to be like Alexander, they get caught in order to be like Alexander, I have to have what Alexander had, but they aren't Alexander in the sense of the hammer and anvil approach and the leading from the front, and none of them are as reckless actually as Alexander. And I think that's one of the factors of Alexander's generalship is that he's not cool, calm, and calculating. He's reckless and adventurous and comes close to death in most of his victories.
Does it show a lack of leadership though? If your sole way of winning a war is just we'll put more in and doing the same things, does that not show a lack of leadership? Whereas Alexander was winning with fewer people, but it's more. Well, maybe you're calling it reckless. Is that maybe it's how it's being written? But actually, that was what it was needed to win. Whereas someone who's with less leadership ability just puts more men onto the field, doing the same thing.
It's a definite leadership style, and I think because Alexander is a conqueror and he is conquering these places, and therefore to conquer them he needs to win. When his Diadochoi get given part of his empire, and some of them seize it for themselves and fight amongst themselves, they're essentially given a huge chunk of empire simply because they were one of Alexander's close companions. And so their investment in staying alive and remaining king of my new empire that I got given is far greater than Alexander's, which is I'm on a mission to conquer and to even if you don't agree with the whole unification of man and the brotherhood of man sort of idea, Alexander had more going on and more, in a way he had less at stake because it was a personal mission, whereas the successors got given an empire and therefore their need to be at the front of their soldiers risking their life to keep it was not Alexander's. They were like, well, I'm still king of the Ptolemaic Empire. So I think that dissipates that whole kind of idea. But the ideal of leadership that Alexander shows, suffering the same, going hungry like his men, walking with his men, that style of leadership is always the example that the ancients hold up as the best example of leadership.
In the introduction to the magazine, it refers to innovations of tactics and equipment. We've already looked at the tactics of just increasing the army sizes. Was there anything else that came out of it?
Well, the Hellenistic period is where the machinery of war starts to get quite involved. So the mathematics of war, the siege engines of Demetrius Poliorcetes, and a lot of our manuals that survive in terms of how to make war machines actually come from the Hellenistic period. So there is innovation in siege materials and innovation in terms of what engines of war you're going to use. There's also innovations in the size of shipping, but it sort of parallels what happens with the phalanx, that you go from having biremes and triremes, and then you get these enormous ships that a lot of people just can't believe that there are ships even contemplated the size that according to the sources that were built. So there's sort of a gargantuanization of the navy and a gargantuanization of the army, so there are innovations. Whether they're effective innovations is a different story. And of course, the other aspect of it is that because they are defeated by the Romans, there's a sort of a hubris in terms of how people approach this the Hellenistic empires. That because the Romans were able to defeat them at kind of Scyphalae and Pydna, clearly they were mistaken, and therefore that whole idea of the Roman system being better. But there's been 2 centuries of stagnation by the time the Romans fight the phalanx.
Well, that's a little bit teleological, of course, and I don't think there's stagnation as such. I mean, you have Theriophoroi who do add some variety to how the infantry looks, of course. But there's one point that I just want to go back to earlier, where you said that the Hellenistic kings didn't take a lot of risks in battle itself, because I was reminded of something that Sid Dean wrote for the issue that I'm working on now, which is on Ptolemaic Egypt, and he has a text box on deaths of Hellenistic kings in battle.
Right.
And he this is based largely, I think, on the book Warfare in Hellenistic Period or something. It's in the same book with Spellinger's book on the same series as Spellinger's book on New Kingdom Egyptian warfare. But anyway, it says that the successive dynasties produced 80 rulers. Many of those only reigned briefly or as co-rulers, and of these, 20 are recorded as dying in battle or as the consequence of battle, and that includes POWs. For example, Umas III, who died as a POW, but it excludes those who died years after captivity. So there are quite a few kings, like Ptolemy VI, for example, who did die in combat. So they weren't, and this is probably because they were, like you said, consciously emulating Alexander. I mean, Pyrrhus of Epirus, for example, is perhaps the clearest case where we know that somebody really, went out there in the Alexander mole and went like, "Look at me," and then of course it all ended a bit in disaster because Pyrrhus was not Alexander. So the same is of course true for all the other successor kings, but they did try to put themselves out there in harm's way, basically. Some of the time, since a quarter of them apparently died in battle or as a POW, which also means that they must have been easy to capture. So it's a little bit more nuanced, perhaps.
It shows how much they were constantly at war.
Well, that's in ancient times. The war is always just around the corner. That's not much of a.
This was largely a civil war too, fought among the Macedonians. That is, the Ptolemy, I think, did the wise thing and focused on maintaining himself in Egypt. But for everyone else, it was a war for the entire empire, and they were not content unless they had it all.
Well, Egypt, of course, is always isolated throughout history because it has desert on two sides, the Mediterranean to the north, not a lot of good harbors, and in the south it extends further into the desert, into Sudan, towards the Sudan, etc., etc. So, yeah, it's very isolated and insulated from the outside world as well. So it's a very good place to keep safe. You see, of course, all the wars that the Ptolemies fight are mostly against the Seleucids, for example, when they try to expand back into the Levant and and towards Mesopotamia, which is what the Egyptians always try to do from at least the New Kingdom onwards.
Where were they drawing their manpower from? I mean, if you're constantly at war, there's only a finite. Each king can only have each leader can only have a state can only have a finite amount of men.
Well, at least in the early stages, I think it was mainly they were using native troops, certainly. They tend to get ignored in the sources, which focus on Macedonians. And so, for example, you have Hieronymus of Cardia, who tended to exalt whatever the Macedonians did. And I think that's why groups such as the Silver Shields, they loom so large in the sources. I think that Diodorus was relying on Hieronymus, who focused on the elites and the Silver Shields. The Silver Shields are the Macedonians par excellence. I can also see how the Silver Shields, despite their advanced years, were much sought after because generals at war wanted that trained Macedonian soldiery. They were very good, and therefore,
and also that legitimization of the link back to Alexander, especially in the early period.
Yes.
So Marc, do you want to give us a quick précis of the Silver Shields up to when they went freelance?
Right. Well, the Silver Shields, they derived from the pes heteroi of Philip II. So they actually go back to Alexander's father as a unit. It was probably formed sometime in the 350s. They were called epilectoi, or picked men. So you can imagine that these were the finest soldiers that could be found all across Macedon, as opposed to the other battalions which were recruited on a territorial basis. The Silver Shields seem to have been an elite group from the start. They fought for Philip. With Alexander, they were called the Hypaspists, and they formed the hinge unit between the phalanx proper, those were the ones that fought with the Sarissa pike, and the cavalry. So they had to be agile, they had to be able to maintain a more flexible formation, keep contact with both the slow-moving infantry and the faster-moving cavalry. They fought that in that hinge formation all through Alexander's big battles. They're at Granicus, they're at Issus, they're at Gaugamela. They're on the eve of the campaign into India, 327, the Hypaspists are renamed as the Silver Shields. That's because Alexander gifted them with silver shields, and that's where they acquire the name Argyraspides, or Silver Shields. And at the same time, concurrently, there's a new unit of Hypaspists, presumably of younger men who might have been a bit more fit and agile and could fulfill that hinge role. And thereafter, they fight as still an important part of the Macedonian army, just not as that hinge unit. They probably carried a hoplite shield in their earliest incarnations and a dory, that 7 or 8 foot long spear like the hoplites carried. Whether or not they rearmed once they they were gifted with these silver shields and became the silver shields with the Sarissa pikes, that's open to question. It's hard to know whether it was worth it for them to. They had so much success with weapons that they already were using, why they would have to retrain or what have you. That's not known. After Alexander's death, all right, so they're going to be demobilized at Opus, and they are demobilized at Opus in 324. They're sent back towards Macedonia. They get to Cilicia, and that's when word comes of Alexander's death. When Alexander dies, they become part of the armies of various successor generals from then on, ultimately taking service with Eumenes, who is their general from, I want to say 319 onward, when he goes back into Asia, and he fights several battles against Antigonus, including the battles of Perydocene and Gabiene. During these battles, even though they're considered to be very old, both Plutarch and Diodorus insist that they were in their 60s, 70s, some older. They're considered to be, I think it's Diodorus's words, athletes of war. They're the best soldiers in the army. They drive all before them. Even when the rest of the army loses at Gabiene, they're able to extract them. They defeated their opponents. They're able to extract themselves from the battlefield because of their great discipline. They form a square and retreat. And in the denouement to their career, which has stained their reputation, Antigonus had captured their baggage, and in their baggage wasn't just all of their personal property, all of their money. It was their wives, their children. They decide that in exchange for getting their baggage back, their wives, their children, that they'll hand over their general, Eumenes of Cardia, to Antigonus. So they betray their general. Eumenes is executed. Their officer, Antigonus, he's thrown into a pit and burned to death. And Antigonus is sends them off to Arachosia to, garrison places in a far-off land. And that's the end of the Silver Shields.
There you go. There's a précis.
Yeah, the thing about them was that is that the only other unit that I can think of who were active, in warfare into old age is Dad's army, because it is. I mean, how realistic do we think? Surely attrition, if nothing else. I mean, I appreciate people lived, not dissimilar to they do now, into their 70s. But surely attrition must have, over the years of constant, warfare. I mean, how realistically, how much of an elite unit can they have been towards the end?
Well, I love the idea of old men being able to do this, because as I've gotten older, my back started hurting more. I find that the idea that senior citizens can fight and do well. But so you make a great point, though, Angus, because in modern armies, men over 30 are considered old. So what was it that enabled these Silver Shields to not just survive, but prosper? They were considered the best. And partly, I think, Well, first, I think it's going back to that they were the best soldiers when they were young, the epilectoi. They were the finest around in Macedonia. They certainly got a lot of exercise, I would say. They were healthy, they were fit. Diodorus and Plutarch are both very clear that they were all old men. There's various modern historians that want to look at that and say, no, they weren't really all that old. They were just a handful of older men, and the part was mistaken for the entirety. But the sources are really adamant that they were this age, and I could see how that in going through the various estimated march rates of Alexander's army in Donald W. Engel's book, Logistics of the Macedonian Army, you come across some very interesting facts about how long it would take them to march and how much marching they would have to do. And each day, maybe about 13 miles was the average you would have to march, and there would be frequent halts. The animals would have to be rested. There'd be camp followers that they'd have to not leave literally in their dust. The pace at which an ancient army would have been moving over most time would not have been especially fast. At least not as I think that we would understand it. I think that they could have kept up. I think that also the phalanx battle, and here I'm looking at Victor Davis Hansen's portrayal of that battle. If it was only for a few hours a day, or over one day, maybe they, as older men, they didn't require the stamina. They were not running a marathon, okay? Yeah. And that also brings me into the nature of the phalanx battle itself, and maybe why Silver Shield's discipline, that they'd done this all before, they had long experience, was the key, not their physical strength, let's say, is that if you're in a phalanx, most of the soldiers in that phalanx holding their spears out, most of them in the rear ranks would not have been directly exposed to the weapons of the enemy. I think that holding formation and not fleeing, not running away, presenting an unbroken hedge of spears to the enemy, that would have been your salvation. That would have kept the enemy at bay. Not necessarily whether you could run faster than that younger man on the other side, but stay in formation, keep together, and in that regard, I would say that their experience probably gave them the edge over younger troops who probably did not have anywhere near the experience that they did.
Yep, and I mean I think that's a standard tradition in the ancient. The ancient men serving to 60 is something that we get in the Spartans. It's something we get in the Athenians. What we know of, for instance, Socrates, who I wrote an article on, he was active as a hoplite from the age of 37 to 42. So that whole idea of an older man being valued for their experience and their discipline, I think, is absolutely solid. And I think also, their lifestyles and there are active older men who do amazing things into their 60s and beyond, who we look at when things start to ache in our 40s and go, oh my God, how'd they do that? But I think, the lifestyle of some of these older men in the ancient world probably would put us to shame completely. But the idea that they would bring in younger, almost apprenticeship type tent buddies to teach them the trade, and that way you actually replenish your ranks. I think that must have been going on, and they must have been getting recruits back from Macedonia and from Greece. This is the age where Greece becomes the mercenary capital of the ancient world. That they are replenishing. It's just that's not what's emphasized. But I think the value of older soldiers and their ability to fight. I mean, there are still old warriors in all shield wall warfare, even right through to the Middle Ages and beyond. You think of the experienced drill sergeants in the 19th century in England's wars of empire. I think that there has been a valuing of older soldiers for a vast period of time, But now we look at, as you say, a soldier in their 30s is past it, whereas that's ignoring their experience and their and what they have to offer in terms of being cool, calm, and collected under fire. Because they've seen it, they've done it, they've been there before. And I think it's almost like a professional athleteization, if that's even a word, of warfare, where you've got these sports heroes who are amazingly fit, but their career's over at 30. If you're 31, 32, it's all over. And I think the military careers have gone the same way, whereas you look at even the ages of the French poilus in World War One, they're not young men, and the average age of the soldiers in World War Two is quite high in comparison to what it is now.
Max Hastings talks about, and I might be slightly misquoting this. He talks about, I think it's a well of courage, and it's not so much the problem with the troops is that for them to be spent is not so much physical stamina and strength and so many other things. It's more of the more of they see battle, the more this well of courage goes down. And actually, there is this thing that the more combat troops see, actually over time they become less efficient, which flies in the face of battle hardened. Battle hardened might just mean we know when we're going to lose, we're going. Rather than the young and foolish who might stay the field and might actually be what you want, those with true grit who think we can come on lads, we can do it. Michael Park, in a previous edition of the magazine, referred to the Silver Shields as having a corporate identity, which I thought was an interesting phrase, talking about esprit de corps. And I wondered if you give someone a corporate identity, does that mean you even have to fight a battle? If it stands out who you are, you being on the field might mean that you don't get attacked. You might be there at the event.
It's a bit the Sparta effect, in other words.
Yeah, because you get the other thing is, of course, there are the Silver Shields. Well, we have to go and defeat them because then we will be the army that defeated them. And I think it's, in a way, it's the problem of every elite unit, because they're going to be singled out and their weaknesses are going to be highlighted by their enemies. That if they're on the field and they fight, then well, let's organize a way in which they fight and are defeated, such as taking their baggage train because they never defend it. So all of that sort of thing is problematic, I think, for these units. But I think one of the problems with the corporate identity, and any elite unit that has that sort of recognized esprit de corps is it does breed expectation, and it breeds having to live up to the exemplar of your predecessors, and that can be an advantage as well as a disadvantage. It's like the Dread Pirate Roberts, really. In that regard, it's possible that they have this sort of identity of being they succeed to a reputation like Sparta. That whole idea that Sparta is, you are Spartan, and we have our modern version of people yelling the word Sparta at us, and people laugh at that, thinking that it's possibly not true. But in Australia, for instance, when they play their state of origin rugby league game between New South Wales and Queensland, apparently if a player goes down injured, all the teammates gather around and all they say to them is Queenslander, as a way of getting them back on their feet, despite broken ribs, is basically appealing to their place of origin. And that's just weird, and it's a bizarre correlation. But you're down on the ground, you've been concussed, and your teammates, to get you back on your feet, are just going Queenslander, Queenslander, and they get back up and play on. And I think that corporate identity effect is possibly there in that sort of thing. That and some of these battle cries that we know are of a similar ilk, that they are simply crying out their own identity, and that makes them cohesive.
And the Silver Shields, to add to that, they'd been together since the 350s. So by the time that they were fighting at Peridikeen and Gabiene in 317 and 316, they may well have been together, the same men together, for 35 years or more. That's a true corporate entity. Most armies in the ancient world, they were, I hesitate to call them militias because that doesn't really do them justice, but in the sense of being called out to the colors and then sent back at the end of the campaigning season, that pretty much covers it. But the Silver Shields, they were together year in, year out. They really did have an identity as Silver Shields, and they wanted you to know it too. And I can only imagine that if you were on the other side of a battlefield against these graybeards, that it was intimidating. Yeah, I think it must have been.
After the Alexander, how did they operate with it? How did they work politically within themselves to figure out who they were going to fight for?
It was Polyperchon. I'll have to check that up, but I'm going to say it's Polyperchon who gave Eumenes the command to go into Asia to represent the interests of the kings. So Alexander's brother Philip Aridaeus and his own son, and he gave the Silver Shields. He basically said to the Silver Shields, "You're going to follow and serve Eumenes." I mean, whether or not that was 100% acceptable to the Silver Shields, they followed him, and they fought. I mean, by and large, they fought very well for Eumenes. That's how they came to serve him, because they were ultimately he was the general in Asia of the Argead kings, the successors of Alexander himself. They were obviously not so attached to Eumenes that they were not willing to hand him over once Antigonus had grabbed their baggage and their wives and children. But that's But until that time, they were loyal soldiers. It was fine up until the very end, and then it got very bad.
What did defeat them in the end?
It was they were not defeated themselves tactically. What happened was that Antigonus was able to send cavalry to seize the baggage in the rear of Eumenes' army, and once he grabbed that, the Silver Shields were presented with a terrible dilemma. They had wives and children that they had acquired over the course of the years of campaigning across Asia. All of the money that they'd ever been either given or found or taken in the time that they were on campaign. Antigonus had it all. He had it all, and so they could either have stayed loyal to Eumenes, who, by the way, was a Greek, not a Macedonian. So that may have been a part of the reason making it easier for them to hand him over, or lose all of their families and their money. So they went in with their families and their money and gave over Eumenes.
Yeah, but they were packed off to
Arachosia. And
then withered?
That depends. Both Plutarch and Diodorus emphasize that they were sent to a faraway land to be sent on dangerous missions as punishment for their betrayal of Eumenes. Maybe, but there's also a theory that Arachosia was in need of good soldiers to defend against none other than Chandragupta, who was expanding his territory in Western India at the same time. So they may have simply been sent to a distant corner of the empire that needed troops, and the idea that it was as punishment was not true.
There was a growth in mercenary units at this time, wasn't there, to try and fill the armies? How were they bought? In the Middle Ages, you would you get your Swiss pikemen, and these units would fight. You're buying a block of men. Again, it's like a corporate identity. How did this work in this period? Did you just go to the mercenary corner and hire a unit?
I expect it would have been the same as in Xenophon's time, where it's men who know other men. It's mostly through friendship ties and couched in terms of doing favors and getting some rewards of some sort. It would have been an ad hoc basis, I think, and there would have been small mercenary bands who would have hired themselves out in that way, as far as I know.
The Peloponnese becomes like the mercenary marketplace, I think, in the period that sort of you can pick up mercenaries on the way on the coast of the Peloponnese.
I just wondered if it's constant warfare throughout the whole period. Are you feeding mercenaries in from outside the area to otherwise you're going to run out of men. Are we getting people from outside coming in wholesale with units and moving them about?
Some of the problem may really result from the nature of our sources. The sources tend to ignore anybody who was not a Macedonian. So it may seem like that, this was a war of armies of just Macedonians fighting other Macedonians, but there were certainly troops from, the areas that these battles were fought over, native troops who were inducted into the armies. Alexander had inducted Persian troops into his army, and they must have been fighting still, so just because we don't hear about them, maybe it seems we're getting a picture of it's just a Macedonian mercenary force or what have you, but I don't think it was.
Well, I was going to say I wonder how they recruited these large armies. Because you have to, you can't be drawing from a small pool. You have to be, as we said, conscripting in everybody. At which point you're pulling away people from the land and doing other day-to-day work. So how did that affect the economy, or did it boost the economy with efficiencies and other ways? I suppose anyone bothered to write about that, did they?
That would require.
How boring! Oh.
To give you a good answer about that, we'd have to know just what the population was of ancient Iran, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Asia Minor, the Levant, and I don't have those kind of figures. I wish I did. These armies were big, but we're talking about armies numbering in the tens of thousands, where there must have been tens of millions of people. So whether or not this was, it doesn't strike me as being a time of national recruitment to fight in the armies of the successors. The one figure that I came across, and this has nothing to do with the Hellenistic kingdoms, but it's Polybius gives a rundown of all of the manpower of Italy on the eve of Hannibal's attack on Italy in the Second Punic War, and he comes to the conclusion that the Italians could have produced 700,000 infantry and 70,000 cavalry. I am not certain how many people lived in Italy in the late 3rd century BC. That's a lot of people. But you would think that now the Romans never put together an army of 700,000 men. You couldn't do that logistically. But it would seem to me to be the case that if you were a successor general in Asia, that there would have been enough people to find the soldiers for your army. They almost certainly had a preference for the Macedonians, which is probably why the Silver Shields were considered to be they were considered to be the best troops around. But I don't think I really can't tell you just whether or not they were straining to bulk up their armies, or whether or not they didn't have too much trouble doing it.
Those regions were very populous, so it right. Seems unlikely that there was straining. I mean, Egypt already, Herodotus refers to it, I think, as the most populous country in the world or something like that. So it's unlikely that they would have strained to produce a few tens of thousands of men to populate the army with.
Was the army size differences between the East and West? Or are they just as big as they can possibly be?
Yeah, it's you never really hear much about manpower problems in the ancient world, as far as I know, except maybe the Spartans, of course, who, especially in the 4th century, start having manpower problems. So that's because they rely a lot on Spartiates, and those are very rare on the ground. But for example, the Romans just seem to be able to have this. We've commented on it before in the podcast. They seem to have this infinite supply of people. Oh, you've wiped out 4 of our armies. Well, here are 3 others that we just whipped up out of thin air, and that seems to be a little bit the case always in ancient times. So either the numbers, ancient writers and numbers are always very dodgy. They're always exaggerated most of the time. Claims that. That if an army is defeated, it's utterly destroyed is nonsense. It's mostly about routing an enemy army, not about totally destroying it. So there's always enough people going about most of the time. And yeah, even in instances, for example, where you hear that an entire city is destroyed and the men are all killed and the women are all taken into slavery, 10 years later, the city is there again, filled with people. And so it's very strange how things are calculated and how people flow in the ancient world, basically, from one place to another. But there never seems to really be a shortage of people.
There's been a lot of work on the manpower of the Romans, but I think the same thing exists for the eastern areas. And again, it's like how boring is talking about the economics of an empire, that because our sources are focused on politics and warfare, anything that they didn't view as being pertinent to that subject kind of gets sidelined. And not that they don't in Herodotean fashion look at amazingly interesting anecdotes. They're always not the purpose of their histories, and so we get a lot of incidental and anecdotal information that we have to extrapolate backwards. Taking Polybius's figure, for instance, we can apply it in a general way to the entire ancient world as a way of trying to estimate what manpower was like across centuries and the entire region. And in many ways, we're forced to do that time and time again in ancient history because we don't have any other information. So we take one known possible fact from one period and we go, so therefore we know this, which in a way we're forced to, because if we come up with questions that there's just no information on, we get very tired of saying that.
Now, the ancients also have no conception of economics as such, as something like religion. Economics, you couldn't have gone to an ancient Roman or an ancient Ptolemaic Egyptian or whatever and said, tell me about your religion or about your economy. It would have made no sense at all because it was all intertwined. And warfare in and of itself, I mean, there's been plenty of writing on warfare as warfare being in ancient times a mode of production, basically, of one way of acquiring wealth and money and land and whatever as an economic thing. So,
and I think that also answers the mercenary question in some ways, and especially through ties of friendship and who you know. It is a get rich quick scheme. That if you, and that remains the mercenary ethos from an economic perspective for a long time, that you can make enough money and plunder and pay, come back and buy a farm, or stay a mercenary and make more, because again, mercenaries tend to spend their earnings wherever they are. And I think that's again why the whole mercenary effect can be an economic boost to an economy, because they are resident and they spend their earnings where they are. And so that it's not necessarily a burden on the economy, because it basically is recycled through it.
Well, armies generate an economy of their own as well. I mean, if an army marches through a country, it attracts traders and prostitutes and whatever who just follow the army along and ply their business, and it's where a lot of the money also goes from that the warriors have, the soldiers, the mercenaries.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those amazing tropes of redisciplining armies is they're always expelling camp followers, and yet camp followers are always there. So it's like, I'm expelling you and I'm redisciplining the army. Great, done. Okay, now the camp followers come back, and then the next general does the same thing through in perpetuity across 1,000 years.
These armies couldn't have functioned without camp followers to cook their food, to mend their clothes. I don't think that these soldiers were self-sufficient in any way, or at least if they could find someone else to cook their food and mend their clothes, they would.
Yeah. Well, by the 6th century AD, the soldiers having slaves to carry their equipment for them is just a given. They understand that they're there. So. But there's this sort of image of the Marian mule in Roman terms, and again in the Hellenistic period, there's the idea of the Macedonian phalangite who is marching self-sufficiently, just like Alexander's did, and the reality of that is just not true.
Well, at the speeds that certainly Marc was talking about, anyone can keep up. It's not particularly difficult, is it? Whereas if you're trying to do these 30-40 mile marches, You need to be as light on your feet with as few people trailing after you as possible.
Typically speaking, when you hear about Alexander making these very long, very fast marches, it's with the cavalry and the light troops, not the phalanx itself, which he would leave behind to go on his various missions. I can only imagine also that when any of these armies were on the march, that the head of the army would get to its destination a lot far ahead of time compared to the trailing part of the army. They would stake many miles along a road or the country, and it would take quite a while for the rear of the army to catch up to where, even if it was just to camp for the night, it would take maybe hours to catch up.
I've read something recently about that. It's ringing a bell, and I can't think what it was. Talking about limiting army sizes for the simple reason that it was impossible to move more men, because by the time one lot had got there, the other lot, it was dead. They couldn't move that far in 12 hours.
Yeah, Herodotus estimates that if Xerxes' army was as large as Herodotus says it was, then by the time the first man reached Thermopylae, the last man was still in Sardis.
Apparently in the ancient world, the largest number of soldiers that could have been, kept under control of one general and marched together would have been about 45,000 men. One of the innovations of Napoleon, the reason why his corps system was, not just successful, why it was necessary, was because you couldn't march armies of 100,000 or 150,000 men together along the same road through the same country. They'd exhaust all the supplies. They needed to split up in order to be able to, like a plague of locusts, feed themselves off of the produce of the districts they were going through. And so Napoleon would bring them all together to the battlefield all at the same time. You couldn't really do that in the ancient world. Too many people marching together would have denuded the district they were marching through of the local foodstuffs. You just couldn't supply it.
Yeah, that's why Herodotus, when he describes the Persian army on the move, he says that they literally drink the rivers dry where they move through. So
I can only imagine that most of these Hellenistic armies would have been living off the land. For the most part, they would have been either requisitioning supplies or just taking whatever they needed.
We need another issue on logistics, which is probably not one of your favourite or best-selling magazines, but a subject I always find fascinating. I mean, I never quite get all the answers to the questions that I don't always know that I want to ask.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those. It's an unglamorous topic, which often gets ignored or mentioned in passing rather than being the focus of. There are again anecdotal pieces of information that tell you how much people needed to be fed and things like that, or how much they were fed, but never as the sort of the focused answer of, how much food do we need to feed an army per day?
What we need to do is for a second look at logistics for the magazine is get, say, 30,000, 40,000 people, dress them up historically, give them the right amount of food, march them to somewhere in Turkey and tell them to go from A to B and see what the problems that people actually have, rather than, it's so easy to extrapolate with 2 or 3 people, but you put that many people on the road and suddenly you have a lot of problems. As it's as simple as everybody needing 40,000 people needing a crap along the road. Where are they all going to go? Eventually the ones at the back are going to be in further and further afield.
I think one of the things about the 13 miles a day is that even people with sprained ankles and cramps and stubbed toes, they can keep up. But the number of men who are going to drop out from all sorts of various reasons as they march, if you've ever tried to walk on a sprained ankle, you're going to fall behind. But we don't hear about that. Occasionally you hear about stragglers but I think exactly that when you've got a vast number of people walking, it's going to cause issues.
And it's not just that. You've got to keep them walking in some semblance of order. Otherwise, by the time they get there, nobody knows where each other is. So you can't form them up the next day. Otherwise, they'll spend hours trying to walk around to find their units to camp together. And then you can't get them together for to deploy them. So somebody has to be along, whipping them along to keep them in some sort of semblance of order. I've been through my meagre questions. Is there any other biting topics to bring up?
I have a good idea of who Caesar was, who Alexander the Great was. I find, though, that it's much more difficult for me to try and picture a Eumenes, a Demetrius, an Antigonus, or a Ptolemy. Not to say that they were all alike, but they simply don't loom as large. I mean, Hannibal, I have a wonderful idea of what he was like. But the Hellenistic generals, the kings, what have you, and we're not even getting into the later kings, such as Antiochus III or what have you. They don't loom quite as large in the consciousness, and I don't know. Maybe they just haven't had the right movie made about them, something like that. Antiochus the Great.
Yeah. I think one of the other issues is that because the Hellenistic period is vital to understand later periods of history, the second sophistic and the position that the Greek occupants have in the Roman Empire, you need to understand the Hellenistic period because of that. It's a vital bridge to the classical Greek period. It's such a sort of essential understanding that we are quite vague on. But it's sort of there, and I think that's one of the problems with making it cohesive. And it's not that Polybius survives for a huge chunk of it, and but it's complex and it's convoluted and it's fragmented, and so all of that sort of plays against it. And often it is it's very simplified that you get Alexander, then Alexander's successors are defeated by Rome, and then you Rome. It's all good. So all of that Hellenistic period is ignored, and almost in the fact that when you get to Cleopatra the Seventh and Caesar and Mark Antony, it's like, oh, are they still around? Oh, okay, right. Oh, God, okay. So that in a way, because our focus shifts to Rome, the only way that we sort of pay any attention to the Hellenistic kingdoms is when Rome comes into contact with them.
The Roman Empire would not have been possible in the East without the foundation laid by the Hellenistic kingdoms.
Absolutely.
It not have been possible at all. They largely, from what I have gathered, took over the administration of the Hellenistic kingdoms, and that became their provinces of the empire.
I mean, the eastern part of the Roman Empire stayed Greek all through the Byzantine period as well. I mean, that's how deep it went, basically. The Romans, despite having conquered and been in the East for 400 or 500 years, they never managed to Latinize it as such. It stayed, so thorough was the Hellenization during the Hellenistic period that it stayed Greek throughout the Roman period and afterwards even.
Well, perhaps we should leave things there. I'd like to thank Josho, Murray and Marc. Don't forget, you can find more information on the magazine and how to subscribe at ancient-warfare.com. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.